In the quiet corridors of global finance, the most dangerous moves are rarely announced with sirens. They happen quietly, behind closed doors, between signatures, trade agreements, and numbers so large they almost feel unreal. And recently, one of those moves sent a shockwave straight through Washington, not because it involved missiles, not because it involved troops, but because it involved $500 billion, $500 billion. And the country making the move was not China, not Russia, it was Canada. Now pause for a moment and think about what that means. For decades, Canada has been seen as America's closest partner, its quiet northern neighbor, a stable ally whose economy is deeply intertwined with the United States. Nearly 3/4 of Canadian exports flow south across the border, their energy, their timber, their minerals, all feeding directly into the American economic machine. But suddenly, something changed. And what happened next shocked Washington, because behind the scenes, Canada began preparing one of the most significant economic pivots in modern North American history, a strategic financial shift worth roughly $500 billion, a shift that, according to some analysts, could slowly weaken one of America's most powerful economic weapons, the US dollar. But that was only the beginning. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the system that has quietly governed the world economy since the end of World War II. The United States dollar is not just a currency, it is the backbone of the global financial system. Oil is traded in dollars. International reserves are held in dollars. Global trade settlements happen in dollars. And because of that system, the United States enjoys a unique advantage. It can borrow more, spend more, and project financial influence across the planet. Economists sometimes call it America's exorbitant privilege. But privileges in geopolitics rarely last forever. And this is where the story changes, because over the last few years, a slow but unmistakable shift has been happening inside central banks across the world. Countries have begun asking a quiet question. What happens if the dollar is no longer the only safe place to store national wealth? Now, imagine you are a government holding hundreds of billions in foreign reserves. You watch geopolitical tensions rising, sanctions expanding, financial systems being weaponized, and you start thinking about risk. That's when diversification begins, and that is exactly where Canada enters the story. For years, Canada's financial strategy looked almost identical to America's: close integration, heavy reliance, deep economic alignment. But recently, Ottawa began quietly signaling something different, something strategic, something long-term. Instead of simply reinforcing the old financial architecture dominated by the United States, Canada started expanding its economic partnerships outward, toward Europe, toward Asia, toward emerging trade blocs that are slowly reshaping global commerce. And behind those partnerships was a financial repositioning plan valued at nearly $500 billion. But the real story isn't just the number, it's where that money is going, because much of it is being directed into infrastructure, trade corridors, energy exports, and strategic investments that increasingly bypass traditional U.S.-centered economic routes. Energy pipelines aimed at global markets, critical mineral supply chains connecting directly with Europe and Asia. New trade logistics designed to reduce dependency on American transport networks. At first glance, it might seem like simple economic development, but behind that announcement was a much bigger strategy, a strategy centered on one thing: economic independence, and that's the part nobody expected. For decades, Canada and the United States operated almost like a single integrated economic organism. Factories in Ontario supplied assembly plants in Michigan. Energy flowed south, manufacturing flowed north. Supply chains crossed the border multiple times before a single product was finished. But as global tensions rise, countries everywhere are beginning to rethink these arrangements. And Canada is no exception, because the 21st century economy is not just about trade, it's about control. Control over energy, control over supply chains, control over rare minerals that power everything from electric vehicles to advanced weapon systems. And Canada happens to sit on some of the largest reserves of these critical resources on Earth: nickel, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, the raw materials that will power the next industrial revolution. And suddenly, global powers are paying attention. Europe wants access, Asia wants access, and Washington assumed it already had it, but assumptions in geopolitics can be dangerous. Because as Canada began negotiating new trade frameworks with partners outside the United States, something unusual started appearing in economic reports. Investment flows that once automatically passed through American markets were being redirected elsewhere. Trade routes once dominated by U.S. logistics hubs were being redesigned. Financial reserves once overwhelmingly concentrated in U.S. assets were slowly diversifying. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. And that steady shift is what made policymakers in Washington nervous, because global financial power rarely collapses in a single moment. It erodes gradually, one decision, one trade agreement, one investment strategy at a time. And Canada's $500 billion repositioning may represent exactly that kind of gradual shift. But the real concern inside Washington wasn't just about Canada, it was about what Canada might represent: a signal that even America's closest allies are beginning to hedge their bets. And if allies start hedging, something even bigger could follow, because economic systems are built on confidence in stability, confidence in leadership, confidence that the system will continue working tomorrow the same way it works today. But when confidence begins to shift, the entire structure can start to move. And this is where the geopolitical chessboard becomes far more complicated, because Canada's strategy is unfolding at the exact same moment that other global powers are also experimenting with alternatives to dollar dominance. China has been expanding yuan-based trade settlements. Russia has pushed aggressively into non-dollar energy deals. Middle Eastern energy exporters are quietly exploring new financial partnerships. And suddenly a question that once sounded unthinkable is being discussed in policy circles. What happens if the dollar slowly loses its central role? Now pause again and think about what that means, because if enough countries begin diversifying away from the dollar, even slightly, even gradually, the economic balance that has defined global power for the last 80 years could begin to shift. And that is why Canada's quiet $500 billion move triggered such intense debate behind closed doors in Washington, not because Canada is an enemy, but because even small shifts among allies can signal the beginning of something much larger. But here's the twist. Canada may not actually be trying to undermine the United States at all. In fact, many Canadian officials argue the opposite. They say this strategy is about resilience, about protecting their economy in an increasingly unstable world, but intentions in geopolitics are often less important than outcomes. Because once economic momentum begins moving in a new direction, it rarely stops. And what started as a strategic diversification plan in Ottawa may end up contributing to a much larger transformation in the global financial system. But that raises an even bigger question, a question that few policymakers are willing to answer publicly. What happens if America's closest allies begin building a world where the United States is no longer the center of the economic universe? Because if that process has already begun, then Canada's $500 billion strategy may only be the opening move. And what comes next could reshape the balance of global power for decades to come. And if that opening move really is underway, then the implications stretch far beyond Ottawa and far beyond Washington. Because once a shift like this begins, it doesn't stay contained inside one country's balance sheet. It spreads quietly, gradually, strategically. And the ripple effects begin appearing in places most people never think to look. Energy contracts, shipping routes, commodity exchanges, central bank reserve allocations. At first, none of it seems dramatic. No headlines, no emergency summits, just small changes in how countries choose to trade, store wealth, and protect their economic futures. But step back far enough, and a much bigger picture starts to appear. And this is where the story becomes far more complicated than a simple Canada-United States disagreement, because Canada's massive economic repositioning is happening at the exact moment the global energy map is being redrawn. For decades, the United States has relied heavily on Canadian energy. In fact, Canada is by far the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States. Millions of barrels move south every single day through an intricate network of pipelines that cross the border like arteries feeding a massive industrial heart. And that arrangement has worked extremely well for both sides. America gets stable energy, Canada gets a guaranteed buyer. But what happens when Canada begins expanding its energy exports to other parts of the world? Now pause for a moment and consider that, because Canada holds the third largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Most of it sits in Alberta's vast oil sands, one of the most resource-rich regions on Earth. For years, limited pipeline access meant much of that oil had only one realistic destination, the United States. But that constraint is beginning to change. New export terminals, new pipeline proposals, new shipping infrastructure along Canada's Pacific and Atlantic coasts, all designed for one purpose: global access. And this is where the geopolitical tension quietly begins to rise, because once Canadian energy reaches global markets more easily, the United States stops being the only customer. Europe becomes a customer. Asia becomes a customer. And suddenly Canadian energy becomes a geopolitical asset on the global stage. But energy is only one piece of the puzzle. The real strategic battlefield of the 21st century may not be oil at all. It may be minerals, rare, highly specialized minerals that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. And this is where Canada's strategic position becomes almost impossible to ignore, because buried beneath Canadian soil are some of the most important materials of the modern technological age: lithium for electric vehicle batteries, nickel for advanced energy storage, cobalt for aerospace alloys, graphite for next-generation electronics, rare earth elements essential for military technology. These materials are the building blocks of the next industrial revolution, and the global race to secure them has already begun. China controls a massive share of rare earth processing. Europe is scrambling to reduce dependence. The United States is urgently trying to secure alternative supply chains. And right in the middle of that geopolitical scramble sits Canada, a stable democracy, resource-rich, technologically advanced, politically aligned with the West, which means every major power wants access, and Canada knows it. That realization is quietly reshaping Ottawa's economic strategy. Instead of simply exporting raw materials south into American manufacturing pipelines, Canada is beginning to explore something far more ambitious, building its own industrial ecosystem around these resources. Battery production, critical mineral processing, advanced manufacturing, clean energy technology, and every one of those industries carries enormous strategic value. But here's where Washington started paying very close attention, because if Canada begins developing these industries independently, some of the supply chains that once flowed naturally into American factories could start shifting north. Now imagine that happening slowly over 10 or 20 years, automotive production adapting, battery technology hubs emerging, new research centers forming around Canadian mineral supply, and gradually the industrial gravity of North America begins to rebalance, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. And steady shifts in industrial power can change the economic landscape of an entire continent. But the real tension didn't begin with minerals or pipelines or trade deals. It began with something even more subtle: money itself. because buried inside that $500 billion strategic repositioning were financial moves that caught the attention of economists around the world. Diversification of sovereign investments, expansion of international partnerships, strategic infrastructure funding tied to non-U.S. markets. None of these actions were openly hostile. In fact, they were framed as perfectly reasonable economic policy. But when analysts began connecting the dots, a pattern emerged. Canada was preparing for a world where economic power might become more distributed, less centered, less dependent on a single financial hub. And that is exactly the kind of thinking that makes global financial systems nervous, because the US dollar's dominance depends on something very simple: habit. Countries use it because other countries use it. Banks rely on it because markets rely on it. Trade flows through it because it always has. But habits can change, and when they do, entire systems can slowly evolve. Now here's where things become even more interesting, because Canada is not acting alone. Across Europe, governments are investing heavily in alternative energy networks and independent industrial supply chains. Across Asia, financial institutions are experimenting with new cross-border payment systems. Across the Middle East, energy exporters are expanding trade agreements that bypass traditional financial channels. None of these actions individually threaten the global economic order, but collectively, they suggest something larger: a gradual diversification of global economic gravity, and Canada's $500 billion strategic repositioning may simply be one piece of that much bigger transformation. But this is the part nobody expected, because the reaction inside Washington wasn't public outrage, it was quiet concern, policy meetings, strategic briefings, economic modeling, because American policymakers understand something many people outside government rarely consider. The most dangerous geopolitical shifts are not the ones that happen suddenly. They're the ones that happen slowly enough that no one realizes the scale of the change until it's already well underway. And if the global economic system is indeed entering a phase of slow transformation, then Canada's strategy might represent something much larger than national economic planning. It could represent a signal that the post-World War II economic architecture is beginning to evolve. But evolution in global power structures never happens without resistance, because the United States still holds enormous financial influence, the largest economy in the world, the deepest capital markets, the most powerful military, and the dollar remains the dominant global currency by a wide margin. So the real question isn't whether America's economic position disappears. The real question is something far more subtle. How much relative influence could shift if the rest of the world begins building alternatives? Because influence in global economics isn't binary, it's relative. And even small changes in that balance can reshape alliances, trade routes, and strategic partnerships. But here's the deeper layer of this story. Canada's strategy may actually be about something far more pragmatic than geopolitical rivalry. It may be about survival in a rapidly changing world, because the global economy is entering a period of enormous uncertainty, technological disruption, energy transition, supply chain fragmentation, geopolitical competition. Countries everywhere are preparing for a future that looks very different from the past. And Canada, sitting on vast natural resources, advanced infrastructure, and strategic geographic access to both the Atlantic and Pacific, may be positioning itself to thrive in that future. But positioning always creates tension, because when one country strengthens its independence, others begin asking difficult questions. Questions about loyalty, questions about alignment, questions about who benefits most from the next phase of global economic transformation. And those questions are now quietly echoing through the halls of power in Washington. Because if Canada, America's closest ally, is preparing for a more multipolar economic world, then the next phase of global power competition may look very different from the last one. But the biggest twist in this entire story is still ahead, because the $500 billion strategy unfolding in Canada may not simply reshape trade routes or supply chains. It may trigger something much bigger, a strategic recalibration of alliances, a new economic balance across North America, and possibly the first real glimpse of what the post-dollar world might eventually look like. But to understand how serious that possibility really is, you have to look at what happened next, because after the strategy began unfolding, something unusual started happening in quiet economic briefings across Washington. Not panic, not alarm, but intense analysis. Teams of economists, intelligence analysts, and trade advisors began running long-term projections. What happens if Canadian exports diversify faster than expected? What happens if energy flows increasingly move toward Europe and Asia? What happens if North America's most resource-rich country begins building independent industrial dominance in the very technologies that will define the next century? And most importantly, what happens if other allies begin following the same path? Because in geopolitics, imitation can be more powerful than confrontation. If one country successfully repositions itself economically, others start studying the blueprint, and suddenly Canada's strategy starts to look less like an isolated national policy and more like a potential template. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating, because while Washington was quietly analyzing the risks, another group of strategists was seeing something very different: opportunity. Because if Canada succeeds in building a powerful, independent supply chain ecosystem, one centered on energy security, critical minerals, and advanced manufacturing, North America as a whole could actually become stronger, but only if cooperation evolves along with the changing economic landscape. And that realization sparked an entirely different conversation, one that few people outside policy circles ever hear: the conversation about the future of the North American Economic Alliance itself. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been defined by proximity and integration, shared borders, shared infrastructure, shared industries. But the global system that created that arrangement is changing. Trade is becoming more regional, supply chains are becoming more strategic, resources are becoming geopolitical assets, and that means alliances must evolve as well. But evolution can take many forms. One possibility is deeper integration. Canada strengthens its resource industries while American technology and capital accelerate industrial development across the continent. Another possibility is strategic independence. Each country builds parallel systems designed to compete globally rather than operate as a single economic engine. And the difference between those two paths could shape the next 50 years of global power, because North America is already one of the most powerful economic regions on Earth. Combined, the United States and Canada possess enormous advantages: energy abundance, technological leadership, massive agricultural output, critical mineral reserves, advanced military capabilities. Few regions on the planet can match that combination of power.